Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Cameron English here with you, Director of Biosciences at the American Council on Science and Health. Joined again by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, our Director of Medicine. Chuck, how are you this
Good. How
day?
are you doing today, Cameron? A little warm out on the island. I gather it's equally warm in middle of California.
It will be shortly. It's a pleasant morning thus far, but I have my eye on cooler pastures, so shall we say. So
Good.
We'll see what happens. All right. Well, we're not here to talk about the weather in California or anywhere else. We're here to talk about some science and medicine. And we've got two stories in particular. The first is one that Chuck wrote, and I wrote the second. First has to do with COVID vaccines and more specifically adverse events from Pfizer and Moderna shots. So this is myocarditis or pericarditis following mRNA COVID-19 vaccination. Chuck, your titles are always just very, very, this is what I'm telling you about. I really appreciate that in your writing.
Oh, thank you. Because others within the organization would like something a little bit more clickbaity.
Who could that be? I have no idea. And then the second story, which we'll get to in a minute, is one that I wrote. It's called "The GMO Industry," in quotes, "just wants to sell pesticides. Anti-biotech activists wrong again." Okay, but Chuck, this one is a little more time sensitive and probably more on people's minds at the moment, and it has been for, I don't know, over a year now, since the first shot came about in December 2020, I think it was now.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing topic for within a few weeks of the vaccinations getting rolled out to the public. And it has to do with two conditions. One's called pericarditis, which is an inflammation of the sac that is around the heart. And the purpose of that sac is to provide a buffer from the lungs and the chest wall and to provide a little bit of lubrication so that the heartbeat is pretty smooth and you don't feel it. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the middle layer of the heart wall. And both of these conditions can result from any kind of viral infection. Most of the time, the underlying cause can't be identified. And the general symptoms that people experience are some discomfort in their chest associated with it. And very early on in the rollout of the vaccines, it became apparent that some group of individuals, predominantly young males, were being bothered by these episodes, and it's become a flashpoint for the anti-vax crowd. I cannot tell you how many articles I've received with lists and lists of people that have experienced sudden death that have been reported in various newspapers. And actually, when you go back and you look at it, there's really no known cause for why they died, or some of them died 4 or 5 days after eating something. They sent me one article that said this myocarditis was the cause, and it was 6 months after the person had been vaccinated. So it's just crazy town. So I was really excited when I saw that we finally got a study posted that took a little bit more of a deep dive into what was going on and came from JAMA, which is not an unreasonable source.
And now there's been a handful of studies since the vaccines were released, just basically looking at adverse events data, either from VAERS here in the U.S. or some other passive surveillance system. I know Mexico has one, Canada has one, Europe, of course, has one. So you have researchers in these countries just basically looking at this data, and the regulatory agencies in these countries are required to do so when a new vaccine comes out. But this one is a little more interesting in my mind because it's a longer data set. I believe it's over a year's worth of adverse events. Do I have that right? So talk about that for a minute.
Okay, so we collect all the adverse data, and this particular study comes out of Canada's reporting system, and reporting is mandatory for any case of possible myocarditis or pericarditis that comes to attention of a health professional. So right away, please understand that there are going to be some cases that are undercounted because if you don't go to the doctor, it's not reported. I would argue, though, that anybody that has myocarditis or pericarditis and the symptoms are so mild that they don't require medical assistance, we can probably safely ignore them. But I just want to give that as a caveat. And basically what they looked at is about 21 months, and they looked at 19 million doses of RNA vaccines that were administered and discovered 417 cases of myocarditis and pericarditis. So those are the cases that form the basis for the study. As it turns out, the only real way to be assured that you have either one of those conditions is to do a biopsy. And there are very few people that are willing to come in and have us take a little piece of their heart out to see what's going on. So there's been a scale developed, a Brighton Collaborative Scale, which is a group of people that are interested in myocarditis and pericarditis in general, that developed this scale back in 2001. And they took the top three criteria for being certain that this was the diagnosis, and that really became the data set. So the original 417 cases became basically 300 cases. And what they found was that 80% of these cases were occurring in males, and the median age of these individuals was 24. So the people that had been arguing that there was a signal in the adverse effect data were in fact correct. There was a signal, and here were the cases. Now, I would also add that because the pandemic was a dynamic event, you had to really wait a while to get enough data to have a conversation. It's not a whole lot different than the case fatality rate, which changed so dramatically over the course of the pandemic. Early on, all the vulnerable people were getting COVID, and we had a very high mortality rate. Now, COVID seems to be affecting nearly everybody. The people that were most susceptible and frail are gone, and the case fatality rate is dropped significantly. Similarly, for myocarditis and pericarditis, until you had given this to a lot of people, there wasn't enough data to have any kind of meaningful conversation about what the statistics were. And what they found that I think that was particularly interesting was that, again, as the signal had suggested, the individuals getting Moderna, for whatever reason, had a higher incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis than the individuals receiving Pfizer's drugs. And that was significant. For the Moderna people, the case rate was 300 out of a million individuals. For Pfizer, it was 59. So significantly different.
So many questions came to mind as I was reading your story, and I don't know if anybody has answers to these yet. Maybe we won't for several years, but do we have any idea why young men, and I think it's like late teens into your mid 20s, these seem to be the people at the greatest risk of these particular adverse events from the mRNA shots. Do we have any idea why that is?
No, I don't think that there's any really good information at all on why that might be. Everything would be hypothesis at this point. It's clear that part of COVID's mechanism of action in terms of causing disease is that it causes an inflammation of the inner lining of the arterial wall. And to the degree that may be replicated in the pericardium, that may explain some of the cases going on. But I haven't seen anything yet that says, this is the underlying reason. And again, it's strange because the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are essentially the same. They differ only a little bit in terms of the carrier molecule, but the mRNA is identical.
And that was my next question: is why would one of these elicit a more negative response in certain cases? Could it be a matter of dosing? Because I know one has a higher dose.
Yes,
or could
Moderna
it be the
has a
interval?
higher dose.
Okay,
and so that may account for some of the difficulty. And I think that a lot of this conversation about vaccines and boosters also is entangled in how quickly these vaccines came out and how they were launched in the middle, again, of a pandemic that was dynamic, that was changing over time. Part of what you would have expected in the 8 or 9 years that it takes to develop a vaccine is they would have optimized the dose, and they would have optimized the interval at which the primary series of treatments would have taken place. Here they took their best guess and said, here's our dose, and they're 1 month apart. What the Canadians found, and has been shown elsewhere, is that if the second dose is given further out from the first dose, longer than 4 weeks, it's 6 weeks and 8 weeks, the incidence of pericarditis and myocarditis also continued to drop. So part of the problem was that we never really optimized what the primary treatment would be. And that also, for whatever sake it's worth, is the same as when we start having these conversations about booster shots. Because the booster shot at this point in time is no different than the medication that was given to on the first 2 injections. So in some senses, it very well may be that the primary vaccination period should have been a much longer period with those 3 injections spaced out. There's no reason to keep locked into the idea that the 2 doses a month apart was, the end-all be-all and the optimal way to do it.
You point out along these lines that when these conclusions started to come in, when the results started to come in, Canada actually altered the recommendations for the vaccines. I believe they spaced out the interval between the shots.
They did 2 things,
talk about that. Go ahead.
They did 2 things. One was that they spaced out the shots, and second of all is they suggested that for this particular subgroup, males in the ages of 12 to 29 roughly, that instead of getting Moderna, if they'd already gotten Moderna, they should get Pfizer as their second shot or their third shot. And that's good. Again, the targeted, though the mRNA is essentially identical, but by giving the second dose as Pfizer, they again reduce the risk of pericarditis, myocarditis. So again, what you see is that with some time and patience, which is why I started writing the article, we can modify our protocols to optimize the benefit and to decrease as much as possible some of the deleterious side effects. So if I was offering the the vaccine at this point to this age group, I would talk about Pfizer because it's a lot less. And if they'd already had Moderna, I would suggest Pfizer as their follow-up. That's what the data says to me.
What I'm wondering is why we weren't able here in the U.S. to respond as, reasonably maybe. Because like with the Johnson & Johnson shot, there was that concern about blood clots, and that was in women. And the way that we handled that was to just pull off the market. And then I think it was like a month later, like, okay, it's fine. Here's some updated guidelines.
Yes.
And that caused
we've not had a great measured response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So talk about that. Why do you think that is, especially for these vaccines?
I think that there is a bureaucracy that is very tough to move when you're dealing with the federal government. I think the Canadian bureaucracy is smaller because, in fact, the country is smaller and therefore maybe a little bit more nimble. I think that part of that reason that the U.S. response is a little slower is because the U.S. remains a world leader. So when they speak, everybody is listening, and that tends to make an already conservative medical establishment perhaps more so. But all along the way, the communication has been quite poor. talking about it. From my point of view, as a lapsed academician and a now lapsed community surgeon, I think that the doctors in the community have a better handle on how to talk to people than the bureaucrats in Washington that, have everything go through the attorneys before it hits the streets.
It seemed to me, and I mean, everyone's got an opinion on what the government did wrong. It seems to me that there was, without stating it publicly, there was this eagerness for everyone to cover their own asses. And I get that. That's a normal human instinct to want to, shift blame and make sure that you're not blamed for things that you didn't do, and maybe sometimes things that you did do. But it just took a very dysfunctional form. You had the CDC saying one thing, you had the FDA sometimes saying another, you had the administration itself sometimes saying another thing. And so I could imagine for the average person, I'm just thinking of someone like me, you're trying to get good information and make sense of this, and everyone's contradicting everybody else. And then you have the media screaming at you to believe what everybody's telling you, and you're just sort of left in a lurch. And I can understand why people would develop a certain level of concern or even skepticism. Not the idea that the vaccine's going to give you monkeypox or any of this kind of foolishness, but just you're wondering what you're supposed to do with this information, which cannot be harmonized.
It's true. Well, and I think another one of the problems is that a lot of the voices, including mine, are not epidemiologists and infectious disease people. And so some of the nuance of vaccinations and vaccination history were not known and are not at least apparent to us. And so we went off, making these very wild kind of statements, or making statements based on what common sense had told us. For instance, people that have had the polio and the measles vaccine which is what I grew up getting. Those are the shots that we grew up with in my youth. That was one and done. And so a lot of people equate, you get the vaccine, you do not get the disease. And for polio and measles, that's the case. But it's not the case for seasonal flu. And as it turns out, it's not the case for SARS-CoV-2. And that kind of nuanced understanding that all vaccines are not one and done wasn't communicated, and then became a wedge issue that various people who had their other agendas made use of, further adding to the disinformation that's out there. I mean, I would have to say that in the 2+ years now that I've been following and reading and covering this, I've learned a lot more about immunology than I managed to acquire during my time as a surgeon.
Yeah, you can't help yourself because it's just always in the news, and it's always in the journals, and it's everywhere. And it's like listening to pop music. You just learn it because it's all around you. So, but it's good that you're giving folks this information. And there's one takeaway for me. You mentioned this other study where they're looking at adverse events, and they're comparing vaccinated individuals to, I believe it was people who were hospitalized without COVID. And if I'm not mistaken, the rate of pericarditis or myocarditis was lower in the vaccinated group than it was in these non-COVID hospitalized patients. I thought that was a pretty interesting takeaway. So talk about that, and then I've got one question that was from one of your readers.
What they found, in point of fact, is they looked across the hospitalized patients in general, and there was this very small incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis amongst people that did not come into the hospital for COVID, completely other reasons. And so that was kind of the baseline number that they looked at, and that they found that people that came into the hospital with COVID had a higher incidence, but that it was far less with either of the vaccines. So that would suggest that once again, for hospitalized patients, the vaccines reduce hospitalization and reduce the incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis overall, which is what led to the question that I think that the reader brought in that you want to ask. So let's do that.
Yeah, and I thought there's a few assumptions built into the question that I don't think are necessarily justified, but it is a good question nonetheless. So this individual writes, the benchmark for vaccines is vastly higher than the benchmark for other therapeutic interventions. And he's talking about adverse effects, because you mentioned in the article, we balance the risks and the benefits of any drug before we give it to people. So he goes on, he says, when a person with a disease comes for treatment, there is a lower benchmark because the person is already sick. And as all medications have side effects, these are balanced against the natural history of the disease. But in the case of vaccines, we're talking about healthy people and giving them a potentially toxic drug. And he concludes, the benefit must be overwhelming. In the case of COVID-19, it is not. COVID-19 is little risk to the general population unless there is a comorbidity that the person has. So weigh in on that. What do you think?
So, I saw the comment and it was going to require some math to work it out. So I originally didn't say anything at all in the article itself. But when we talked about the question now, I said, let me go run some numbers and see what that trade-off really gets to be. Because the reality is part of what he's saying is that COVID is very rare in this age group, and myocarditis is even rarer. And so what proof do you have that the vaccines are beneficial in that group? So I pulled some numbers and we'll make them available in writing for us. But basically, the current CDC data suggests that about 10% of this age group develops COVID infections. And so I'm going to talk about it based upon that kind of a general number. If we took 1 million individuals and looked, the general rate of myocarditis is 9 individuals out of that 1 million. For the same 1 million individuals, taking 10% of them, representing this age group, and the attack rate of myocarditis on all patients with COVID, it turns out to be 146. So first statement we can make is that COVID definitely significantly increases your risk of developing myocarditis or pericarditis. If you look...
Oh, sorry.
So,
go ahead.
So hang in that. As I said, that's got a little wonky. So the other data says that when they looked at the people that developed myocarditis associated with COVID, it occurred 7 times more frequently in the unvaccinated than the vaccinated. So if we look at that 146 people, the ones that we have identified now that had the myocarditis, 129 of them would have been unvaccinated, and 17 of them would have been vaccinated. Okay? So here's the way the numbers finally go. If you're unvaccinated, 129 out of the 100,000 will develop myocarditis if they have not been vaccinated. Will Pfizer protect you? The answer is yes, because you take the 17 patients that were vaccinated and got the myocarditis and the 59 individuals that got myocarditis from the Pfizer itself, and it comes to 76. So 129 versus 76. Being vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine is net benefit. Moderna, on the other hand, is a different case because Moderna had 300 individuals develop myocarditis simply from the vaccine. So the numbers there are 317 receiving Moderna versus 129 not being vaccinated at all. So bottom line, the Pfizer vaccine is protective in that age group and is worth giving. Now you can argue whether the difference between 76 and 129 is worthwhile to any given individual, but on a population basis, the math says give them the Pfizer vaccine.
So a final question before we move on to the second story we're going to talk about. I would imagine the immediate retort to that is going to be, well, the benefit of the vaccines has decreased significantly for many, many people because we know, and I think it's pretty well accepted that the vaccines don't stop transmission any longer. And you've been one of the people on the forefront saying, well, yes, that's true, but there's still some benefit in getting the shots. So I think you can correct me if wrong, but I think someone in that position would say, it probably still helps you clear the virus quicker if you do get it, or it lowers your viral load. There's some sort of mechanism by which it makes you less sick and less likely to die, even now. And so that would provide the necessary benefit for people to still get it. What are your thoughts there?
I think you're right, but I think the problem ultimately comes down to the fact that you're talking about a low-risk group, we think, and a changing virus. The subvariants are attacking different age groups over time. So it's very tough to issue a national guideline, which is not going to change very quickly, in the presence of a virus that hasn't read the guideline and can change at whatever rate it wants. So I think that at the front lines, most physicians will be saying that overall, the numbers say being vaccinated is more beneficial than being unvaccinated. And there will always be edge cases where you can argue these numbers, that 76 versus the 129, and say, and you can make up whatever statistic you want to make up to discuss about whether that's an important number for public health versus the important number for the individual. I think the guidelines are there to provide guidance, not to say what has to be done, and that the best place to have that conversation is with the physician that you get your health care from, because they know you the best. They know your locale the best.
Perfectly reasonable analysis. And maybe the key takeaway from this discussion is that federal bureaucracies are just not very good at responding in real time to viruses that have no interest in reading their guidelines. That's really rude of BA.5 to just not even consider what the CDC thinks. But
I know it's unbelievable.
I know, it's just what a jerk. What a jerk. Okay, well let's leave that there. I think that's some helpful information for people that want it. Is it going to solve the dispute? Of course not. Because ultimately, I don't think the vaccine fight is about the science. I think there's ideological and political motivators behind it. But in any case, we'll return to that another time. Let's talk a little bit about biotech companies selling their genetically engineered seeds to sell pesticides. Chuck reads carefully through medical journals, and I do that sometimes for story ideas, but other times I just troll Twitter, which I have a love-hate relationship with. I feel like being on social media, Chuck, it's kind of like being in a relationship with someone who has borderline personality disorder because there's beautiful information. You can follow scholars, you can follow really good thinkers and learn a lot, but then you can also be called stupid and useless and a bigot and a racist and a jerk. And anyways, in any case, I was looking at Twitter the other day, and I follow an activist group, an anti-GMO group called GM Watch. They're based in the UK, and they came up with this idea, this sort of glib tweet about a biotech company called Cibus. And Cibus makes they develop gene-edited crops. There's all kinds of traits they have in development, but one of the traits they work on is herbicide-tolerant crops. So farmers can plant these seeds, grow the crops, and then spray the crops with an herbicide without killing them, and it only kills the weeds. And the data is pretty clear that this is beneficial in terms of the amount of pesticide that's used, and we'll get into that in a second. But GM Watch in this tweet, they said, when they're in the public, these companies say we think these crops are good and farmers should grow them because they reduce pesticide use. Everybody wants to reduce pesticide use. It's a win-win, right? And then they quoted presumably a document that CBIS sends to potential investors. And that document says this is going to open up the market for more use of these agrochemicals. And this is a good business model. And so the idea is that, when they're in public, they're giving you their talking points. But in private, when they're talking to people who might give them money, they're giving you the lowdown. And as I said in the story, big if true, right? This would be somewhat scandalous if this were true. But that's actually not. It's actually not what the document says. And you can just go to, you can read the tweets that GM Watch put out, and you can go to CBIS's website and you can read it there too. And what they actually said is that the approval of gene edited tech will open up one of the biggest opportunities in agriculture, new markets for these crops. Now, when they say markets in quotes there, they're talking about farmers around the world who want these seeds. And that, of course, prompts the question, why do they want these seeds? And the answer is because it helps them control weeds more efficiently. And if you kill weeds can't suck the nutrients that the crops you're growing need. So your yields increase. That's the ultimate result, is you get more out of the same amount of land and the same amount of inputs. And you're spending less on pesticides, which are relatively expensive. And then you're spending less on fuel because you don't have to till your field to kill the weeds before you plant. So this is a benefit for everybody ultimately. But the reason there's a market for these seeds is because farmers see the benefit in them. And my first point in the story was, if GM Watch is correct, what they're saying is farmers buy seeds that confer no additional benefit but cost them more money. And if you think like a businessman for just a second, you can see why that's fallacious. Nobody would do that. You don't have to have an MBA, as Chuck does, to say, well, I'm not going to spend money on something that's not going to do me any good. So what are your thoughts?
Oh, I would quite agree. I think that they're speaking to two different audiences. They're talking, one, to the general public about their corporate social responsibility when they talk about reducing pesticide use and making farming more sustainable. And they're talking to an investor class when they talk about the fact that they have a product that they think is going to be a big seller in the market. And what I think gets lost in there is that when you switch over to a more targeted use of an herbicide, because you have a resistant crop to be working with, you can reduce your cost. You can reduce the amount of other pesticides being used. It's not necessary that the whole market is going to expand and they're going to continue to be using all the evil chemicals just as much. You can see a significant decrease in what's being used overall. So I would agree with it. And I think that, for everybody, you're correct in saying that it makes no sense to spend more money to get the same product. It just cuts into your margins. And the margins in farming are not great enough that they can afford to be spending money on things that are not going to improve yield. They're just not there.
Absolutely. And more a general point, I didn't mention this in the story, but for you out there listening, if you're not aware, typically farmers use something like 8 ounces of active ingredient in the weed killer. So for Roundup, which is the big brand everyone knows, glyphosate's the active ingredient. Farmers would use probably, maybe 8 or 10 ounces of active ingredient mixed in with much, much more water. So when you see a tank sprayer and it's blasting a cornfield or whatever, that's mostly water that's being sprayed because you need that to disperse the pesticide. So we're not talking about people drenching crops or drowning your food in toxic weed killers. I think that's an important point to stress. But the other point that you brought up, which is that these are not all created equal. We hear a lot of talk about toxic pesticides and pesticides this and pesticide that. There's different chemicals. They have different uses. They have different active ingredients. They have different toxicities and so forth. And one of the things that these companies have focused on is making these seeds tolerant of less toxic herbicides. So You're absolutely right. The absolute use of one of these chemicals may increase significantly, and that's true for glyphosate starting in the mid 90s. You can see that it increased significantly, but it offset the use of other weed killers that are much more harsh. They can be used safely, and they were for many years, and they still are in certain circumstances. But relative to glyphosate, they are more toxic, so they're relatively worse for the environment. And so if you can switch to these alternative chemicals, it's a boon for everyone. It's a win for everyone. And that's why, as I said a minute ago, that's why there's a market for this. That's why most people are accepting of this technology.
Yeah, I think the other point you really have to get at when you talk about any of this stuff is the productivity that we've experienced in terms of our food production, and that productivity is necessary to carry the population that now is on the planet, and that there's more and more evidence every day that pure organic farming without the use of any of these chemical agents does not provide enough yield to support the population we have. So unless people are willing to say which groups are no longer going to be eating, it's unrealistic to say that we have to drop all of this today. We may very well find that there are more sustainable ways to carry out agriculture. But it's not going to happen overnight.
Certainly. And I think the most appropriate perspective to take, and I've talked to a lot of agricultural scientists and a lot of toxicologists about this over the last few years. And the general consensus among these folks seems to be, we're not pro-GMO, we're not anti-GMO, we're not anti-organic or pro-conventional, we're pro everything that works. So there may be certain circumstances when organic production is a good fit. And there are ag schools like UC Davis out here in California where I am. They have a whole program dedicated to organic farming research. And the reason they do that is it's sort of like intentionally tying one of your hands behind your back and creating a challenge and trying to surmount it without the other tools that you have available, because you're trying to develop new ways of doing things. So it's not, sometimes in the media, this is portrayed as, the science is pro-GMO, and if you don't, we'll jump off a bridge. And that's really not the case. It's just a matter of, let's use everything that works. Let's research everything we can, because this is an ongoing battle. It's really evolution that you're talking about when you're talking about controlling weeds and controlling pests. So you need a diversity of tools in order to overcome these.
Well, I agree. It's interesting, because I was just looking at an article this week from the Financial Times talking about the increasing development of vertical farming, which uses no pesticides, no herbicides, nothing, because it's within a closed environment. So from that point of view, it makes great sense and is going to be sustainable, with the exception of the fact that it require bringing in energy for sunlight, you bring in energy to build the building, and all these other costs that you don't necessarily take into account, so that it very well may be a very good approach to farming. But to say that it's the answer just because it's not going to involve herbicides or pesticides is just a wrong argument to make. Let me just, one more thing. I want to just recommend a book, if you don't mind, by a guy named Vaclav Smil, S-M-I-L. It's called How the World Really Works. And he has a long chapter in there talking about the energy inputs to agriculture and how they have changed agriculture over time, and how much fossil fuel, the great Satan, is used in the production of agriculture. And it will, I think it gives you a much better context for understanding where we are today, so we can start making some realistic plans to be somewhere else tomorrow.
Absolutely. Read that book. Read lots of books. Books are good for your brain. Spend less time on social media, and the world will be a better place. So yeah, Chuck, I think you should recommend as many books as you read because it's super helpful. One final point I want to make, and this has to do more with the rhetoric that GM Watch used than really anything else, but the new phrase among these activist groups is new GMOs because as you were just saying, there's new technologies coming online like gene editing, which allow researchers, plant breeders specifically, to edit the existing DNA of the plants and the animals that we eat. And there's all kinds of useful traits that come out of this. So disease resistance in animals and plants, herbicide tolerance. Lots of things can be done if you can just make very small surgical changes to the genomes of these organisms. And the anti-GMO groups can't abide. This is unacceptable. So instead of calling these what they are, which is gene editing, like CRISPR-Cas9, they call them new GMOs. And the other point I made in the article is that this is a dubious distinction. It's a distinction without a difference because every breeding method genetically modifies the target organism. It would be something like saying, natural sexual reproduction is the way the world is, and that's how we should have children. And then saying, well, if you have a baby through IVF, well, that's a GMO baby, and we don't want GMO babies. Those are, their DNA is genetically modified. Now, in that context, everyone would go, well, that's dumb because every child is genetically modified relative to their parents.
Yes.
Right? That's what reproduction is. So when you take an example like that and you apply it to food and farming, it puts things in a different perspective because there's lots of breeding technologies that have been used for thousands of years. Grafting is the classic example in the wine industry. Almost every bottle of wine you buy today is grown from grapes that come from a vine that has been grafted to a disease-resistant rootstock because you grow wine grapes. The insects try to eat the plants like they do everything else. And what you're doing there, you're literally combining two different plants when you graft. It's the classic example of a frankenfood, but these are technically not transgenic, meaning they don't contain, well, they do. That's the thing, they do. You're combining two different plants, but you're not moving a single gene from, say, sunflower over to wheat. And therefore, it's not a GMO in the popular understanding of the word. But I think, and there's a few other researchers and writers like Henry Miller's an ACSH advisor, Dr. Henry Miller, former FDA regulator. He's been big on this throughout his career, is saying, this distinction between organic and GMO and conventional, this is all silly because you're shuffling DNA anytime you breed a crop. It's just the way it is. So that was a passing point that I wanted to make. There's all sorts of breeding methods, and the fact that we distinguish one from the other on this artificial basis makes no sense, and it just scares people for no reason.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you're 100% correct in saying that they're all genetic modifications. And I live only a few miles away from from Brookhaven Laboratories, where they used to radiate the plants and to see what would grow from that. It seems to me that the newer technologies are allowing us to be much more targeted, much more strategic about looking for modifications that improve the quality of the plant, improve the quality of the yield. And again, as I said, should we not pursue this, then we're going to have a really, really serious conversation about limiting the number of people on the planet, because we will. It is already a project to feed everybody.
Well, we have some real world data on that recently. That was tried in Sri Lanka, where these activist groups were able to convince the government to switch to all organic growing, which required a ban on synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. And of course, that crashed their agriculture sector, which is an enormous part of their economy. Food prices exploded. There were shortages. The government naturally said, these rich people are hoarding all the food. Let's blame them. And the public rushed the president's mansion and started swimming in his pool. And they said, we're not leaving until you resign. So 2 days later, he left the country. So there's a very small, tragic example of what happens when you don't feed people. And it's not because there was any, the war in Ukraine has caused some serious problems in terms of food production and trade and so forth. But in this case, the government just said, we're gonna hamstring ourselves for no reason because Vandana Shiva told us to do so. And you see what the results are. So I could talk for another 10 hours about that, but I won't. And we'll leave it there.
Well, at least say that there's an article up on the website that discusses it directly.
There is. I have opinions on everything. Yes. But if you just go to ACSH.org, type Sri Lanka into the search bar, you'll find, I believe I've written 3 articles now about this. Chuck's also written some really good stuff about organic agriculture on a mass scale, Europe's plans through the Green Deal to switch, over the next 10 years, they're going to, 50% of their production is going to be organic or whatever. Yeah, there's lots of good data on that if people are curious. But you should also just go to our website, again, acsh.org. There's a subscribe button at the top. Click on that. Punch in your email address. We will send you our dispatch newsletter 3 times a week. It has all of the stories that we talk about on the show. We look at what people are reading from our site, and then we talk about it here. So if you want to be a little more informed before you show up for these podcasts, go read the stories, and then you'll be ready for this discussion, if you will. And I might add, if you have questions and you want us to address them on the show like we did today, leave a comment on the story because we look at those. And then we use that as fodder for our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. Chuck, as always, it's a pleasure. Have a terrific weekend.
You too.
And we will see you next time.